The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the convoy as it rolled through the narrow mountain pass in northern Afghanistan. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his brow and scanned the ridgeline through his binoculars, that familiar knot of tension tightening in his gut. 15 years in, the teams had honed his instincts to a razor's edge, and right now, every fiber of his being was screaming that something was wrong. His cell, Platoon, Echo Company, had been running operations in this region for 3 months, but today felt different. The villages they'd passed were too quiet, the streets too empty, like the land itself was holding its breath before you jump to conclusions about what happens next. Let me tell you that this story will challenge everything you think you know about courage, about judgment, and about the unexpected places where heroes are found. What unfolds in the next few minutes changed not just the lives of 12 hardened Navy SEALs, but redefined what they believed was possible. The girl appeared so suddenly that Morrison almost didn't see her. One moment, the road ahead was empty. The next, a small figure in dusty traditional clothing stood in the middle of the path, waving frantically. Morrison raised his fist, and the convoy ground to a halt. Through the dust and heat shimmer, he could make out that it was a young girl, maybe 14 or 15. Her face streaked with dirt and what looked like tears. His teammate, Petty Officer Rodriguez, let out a low whistle from the turret. "Sir, we've got a local kid flagging us down. Could be a trap." Morrison knew the protocols. They'd seen it before. Insurgents using children as bait to lure convoys into kill zones. But something in the way this girl moved, the desperate urgency in her gestures, made him hesitate. He grabbed his rifle and stepped out of the vehicle, keeping his weapon ready but not aimed. As he approached, the girl began speaking rapidly in Pashto, her words tumbling over each other. Morrison's interpreter, a young Afghan-American named Farid, hurried forward. After a moment of intense conversation, Farid turned pale. "Sir," she says, "there's a group of Taliban fighters setting up an ambush about half a click ahead. She says her father was killed by them last year, and she's been tracking them. She knows where they are, and she wants to help us." The SEALs exchanged glances, some skeptical, others simply confused. Staff Sergeant Chun spoke up from behind Morrison. "With all due respect, sir, she's just a kid. How would she know anything about Taliban positions?" Morrison studied the girl more closely. Despite her youth, there was something in her eyes, something hard and knowing that didn't belong in someone so young. War had a way of aging people beyond their years, and he'd seen it countless times. But this was different. This girl wasn't broken by what she'd witnessed. She was sharpened by it. Morrison made a decision that would haunt and vindicate him in equal measure over the next hour. "Farid, tell her to show us what she knows, but we do this carefully." The girl, who Farid said was named Amira, nodded vigorously and began moving quickly up a rocky path that branched off from the main road. The SEALs followed, their formation tight and professional, weapons at the ready. Rodriguez muttered under his breath, "This is insane. We're following a teenager into what could be an ambush based on nothing but her word." But Amira moved with purpose, never hesitating, her bare feet navigating the treacherous terrain with the ease of someone who de-walked these mountains her entire life. She led them to a ridge overlooking a narrow valley, and as they crested the top, Morrison's blood ran cold. Below, partially concealed among the rocks and sparse vegetation, he could see them. At least 20 insurgents, maybe more, armed with AKs, RPGs, and what looked like a heavy machine gun. They were positioned perfectly to ambush the convoy route, and if Echo Platoon had continued on their original path, they would have driven right into a massacre. Morrison immediately got on the radio, calling in their position and the enemy contact. But even as he spoke, he realized they had a problem. The insurgents were between them and the convoy. If they tried to flank or retreat, they'd be spotted, and the fight would come to them on ground they didn't control. They needed intelligence, and they needed it fast. He turned to Amira, who was crouched beside a large boulder, her eyes fixed on the enemy below with an intensity that was almost frightening. "Through Farid," Morrison asked, "how many are there exactly? Do you know their weapons?" What happened next would become legend among the teams, though few outside Echo Platoon would ever believe it. Amira rattled off positions, weapons, and numbers with the precision of a train spotter. She pointed to specific locations, describing fields of fire and blind spots, with terminology that made Morrison's jaw drop. Fordheed looked equally stunned as he translated. Sir, she's using actual tactical language. She knows what she's talking about. Morrison studied the girl with new eyes. Where did you learn this? Through Farid. Amira's story emerged in brief, clipped sentences. Her father had been a police officer, trained by American forces before the Taliban killed him. Before it did, he'd taught her everything he knew, not because he wanted her to fight, but because he wanted her to survive. She'd spent the last year watching the Taliban, learning their patterns, their weaknesses, and she'd been waiting for a chance to strike back. Morrison made a decision that would have ended his career if things had gone wrong. Can you shoot? Amira's response was to pull back her shawl, revealing an old Russian-made Dragunov rifle strapped to her back. The weapon was nearly as long as she was tall, but the way she handled it spoke of familiarity and practice. Rodriguez, watching from a few feet away, let out a sharp laugh that was more shock than humor. She's 15, he said, his voice carrying just far enough that several of the other SEALs turned to look. You've got to be kidding me. What's she going to do with that thing? The laughter was nervous, disbelieving. These were men who'd trained for years to reach this level. And here was a teenage girl claiming she could help them in a firefight. Morrison raised his hand for silence, his eyes never leaving Amira. There was something in her stance, in the way she checked the rifle with smooth, practiced movements that commanded attention. Show me what you can do, he said quietly. Amira settled into a shooting position behind the boulder, the Dragunov resting on the rock with steady confidence. She spent a long moment scanning the valley below, her breathing slow and controlled. Then, without warning, she fired. The sound cracked across the valley, and one of the insurgents, a man who'd been walking between positions carrying ammunition, dropped like a puppet with cut strings. Before the echo of the first shot had faded, Amira had chambered another round and fired again. A second man fell, this one who'd been setting up the heavy machine gun. The valley below erupted into chaos as the insurgents scrambled for cover, trying to figure out where the shots were coming from. And Amira kept firing with mechanical precision, each shot deliberate, each one finding its mark. Morrison watched in stunned silence as this 15-year-old girl methodically took apart the enemy position. She wasn't spraying bullets wildly like an amateur. Every shot was calculated, targeted at the fighters who posed the greatest threat, or those trying to organize a response. When an insurgent tried to man the machine gun, she dropped him before his hands reached the weapon. When another attempted to fire an RPG toward where he thought the shots were coming from, Amira's bullet found him first, and the RPG round detonated harmlessly against the rocks behind him. The SEALs, trained warriors who'd seen combat on 4 continents, could only watch in amazement as this young girl did what they'd been preparing to do themselves. Rodriguez, who'd laughed just minutes before, now stood with his mouth open, his rifle forgotten in his hands. Chun muttered a prayer in Mandarin, his usual composure shattered. In less than 3 minutes, Amira had fired 12 shots and dropped 12 targets. The remaining insurgents, demoralized and leaderless, broke and ran, abandoning their weapons and positions in a desperate scramble to escape the phantom sniper who decimated their ranks. Morrison finally found his voice and called in air support to mop up the fleeing fighters. But the immediate threat was neutralized. He turned to Amira, who was calmly checking her rifle as if she'd just finished a routine training exercise, not a life-or-death engagement. Where did you learn to shoot like that? He asked. Though Farid's translation seemed almost unnecessary, the answer was written in every scar on the landscape, in every burned-out building they'd passed, in the hard reality of a country that had known nothing but war for generations. Amira's response, when it came through Faridi, was simple and devastating. My father taught me to shoot before he taught me to read. He said in this land, survival is the first lesson. Everything else comes after. She unslung the rifle and held it carefully, almost reverently. This was his rifle. These were his skills. Now they are mine. And today, I use them to save you. So perhaps his death meant something after all. The convoy made it back to base without further incident, but the story of what happened on that ridge spread like wildfire. Morrison filed his report, knowing how unbelievable it would sound, but every member of Echo Platoon corroborated the details. The brass didn't know what to make of it. A 15-year-old girl had saved an entire SEAL platoon and eliminated 12 enemy combatants with the kind of marksmanship that would have impressed their best snipers. It defied every expectation, challenged every assumption about who could be a warrior. But for Morrison and his team, the lesson was deeper than just tactical effectiveness. They'd laughed, dismissed her as just a kid, judged her by her age and appearance rather than her capabilities, and she'd proven them wrong in the most profound way possible. In the weeks that followed, Echo Platoon worked with local commanders to ensure Amira's safety. They couldn't take her with them when they rotated out, but they made sure she had protection, resources, and a chance at the education her father had wanted for her. Years later, Morrison would tell this story to new recruits, not as a tale of combat prowess, but as a lesson in humility and the danger of assumptions. He'd speak of a girl who carried her father's legacy in a rifle older than she was, who'd turned grief into purpose and pain into strength. He talked about how 12 hardened warriors had learned something that day about courage, about sacrifice, and about the unexpected places where heroes emerge. The desert had taught him many lessons over his career, but none as powerful as this: that heroism isn't defined by age, gender, or background, but by the willingness to stand up when everything tells you to run, to fight when fighting seems impossible, and to believe that one person, even one seemingly powerless person, can change the course of a battle and save lives. Amira had done all that and more, and in doing so, she'd saved not just a platoon of SEALs, but reminded them of why they fought in the first place: to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, even when those same people ended up protecting them instead.